friend of mine. But having made that disclaimer, to say honestly, Shashi is really the kind of man I admire. The kind of man who goes beyond the business of letters and pages and talking in drawing rooms to actually jumping into the mess of the world and engaging with it. I know when Shashi made the move to come back to India some years ago, having spent almost 3 decades in New York and around the world, helming very important assignments for the United Nations, it was a move that was greeted with a great deal of skepticism, largely from my class of people, much of which is present here. And I have to say, it's been incredibly impressive. Shashi, not only did he come back to India, thank you. He got a ticket to contest the Lok Sabha elections. To contest a Lok Sabha election in India means a lot. It's one of the most difficult things to do to win a Lok Sabha election in India, given the background that Shashi was coming from, given the fact that he'd almost spent 3 decades of his life outside of India. He contested the polls from Trivandrum, Thiruvananthapuram, and he won. And that was extraordinary. And then, very, very, I would say, astutely, the government actually installed him in the kind of ministry to which he would have done great justice and honor, which was the Ministry of External Affairs. And in the peculiar way that Indian politics operates, he was made to suffer for something that was no fault of his. He took that with grace, and I think in the long run, because Shashi is still young, by Indian standards of Indian politics, incredibly young, so he's probably going to be there for a long time. I think there were some valuable lessons that were learned about working in a Byzantine city like Delhi and learning to work the politics of India and of Delhi. He's back as a minister, and people like me are thrilled that he is. I think we need people like Shashi in Indian public life, people who bring a kind of intellectual caliber to the work they do, people who have accomplishments behind them. And he is actually reminiscent of the first breed of outstanding Indian public figures, political public figures, who all came from great education, from great learning, and then deemed it their calling, their debt to society, to get engaged with the mess of India and with the mess of Indian public life. I mean, the entire lot of founding fathers are actually of that ilk, who all were highly educated and brilliant, and then they chose public life. It's a gift. It's an instinct that I think we lost in the middle. Through the 60s and 70s and 80s, we developed a contempt, 90s too, developed a great contempt for politics and public life. It's a contempt that was bred into us by our own fathers, who tried to tell us that politics was a dirty business. And the point is, because many of us believed that it was a dirty business, it became that. We have to reclaim politics by engaging it on a daily basis. Societies and countries are actually shaped by the politics they practice. We were a great country in our founding because we had great figures who engaged in the politics. And so I'm really happy to have Shashi here. He's going to be, I'm sure, walking a bit of a tightrope because he's holding office currently. He's a minister in the government. But we're going to talk largely to him about what he's done recently, which has written a book about Indian diplomacy and India's foreign policy over the last 60 years. The book is called Pax Indica. I think it's required reading for anyone trying to understand what is this really peculiar and idiosyncratic trajectory that Indian foreign policy has taken. I know there are a lot of people who complain bitterly. There are a lot of people who want us to go and flatten Maldives and Pakistan on a daily basis because they feel we are big and powerful, and why are we kind of being polite to everybody and anybody. We're going to ask Shashi for a lot of answers. Shashi, what we'll do is we'll jump off at the deep end. We won't be good politicians, we'll just jump off at the deep end. Even as I speak, there is a huge public outcry about something the Home Minister has said, Sushil Kumar Shinde, and that comes in the wake of the beheading of the soldiers on the borders. Now, our single greatest foreign policy challenge for the last 60 years has been, how do we deal with Pakistan, given the very complex nature of our relationship with them, the geographical positioning, the history. I just want you to tell all of us, one, historically, why have we taken the trajectory we've taken with Pakistan? And as we are where we are today, how is it that our foreign policy should actually be shaping itself to deal with the incredible sort of complicated mess of Pakistan?
Fair enough, Tharoor. First of all, thanks for the very generous words, and hi to all of you. It's great to see you here. I thought I'd take a picture of you and tweet it, but unfortunately the sun is shining right at us, and therefore all I'll get is a blank image, but it's lovely to see so many interested people here. On Tarun's question, let me start off, by the way, though I'm here as the writer of that book, Pax Indica, I am, as you know, now a minister, and so I have various restraints that I have to observe, including not saying anything that interferes in the work of another ministry. So please take any imprudent utterances on my part this afternoon as purely personal expressions of a personal point of view. Assume they were expressed before the 29th of October when I took this oath of office. But on Tarun's question, you know, I do believe we've had an existential problem with Pakistan because indeed, as I've written in Pax Indica, really paraphrasing Voltaire on Prussia, our big challenge is that whereas in India the state has an army, in Pakistan the army has a state. And because the army has a state, the army's objectives, including its own aggrandizement, have played a rather large part in the way in which Pakistan has related to India. And a lot of Pakistan's policies towards India have been about keeping the pot sufficiently bubbling to justify the army's disproportionate share of Pakistan's national resources, its GDP, its government budget, and all of which, by the way, the Pakistani military is the #1 in the world in terms of any military's percentage of government resources commanded. So it really is, for us, a challenge because we've got a civilian government to talk to very often, but we can never be entirely very sure that what they say to us, they're in a position to deliver or stick to because they don't fully run the country. Now, this is part of the existential challenge. And then we've got the kinds of specific incidences. There's some this week, there's something else a few months ago, there'll be something else a few months from now. And we have to worry, as a responsible government, do we react to each individual thing that happens, irrespective of the larger picture? Do we somehow manage to hew to a broader strategic perception of what is our interest in Pakistan? Now, what is our broader strategic interest in any foreign policy? Basically, we have to understand that foreign policy must serve our domestic needs. And our overwhelming domestic priority is the transformation of India, the ending of our poverty, the pulling of millions of people out of deprivation and exclusion. That's what India is all about. Any government of India's first business has got to be that. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we use foreign policy to fulfill that purpose? So you may indeed, as Tarun said, have television anchors saying the nation wants to bomb. But in fact, if you're convinced that what you really need in this country is enormous amounts of foreign investment in order to be able to grow your economy and pull people out of poverty, then you also know that investors don't like to invest in war zones. And you ask yourself, how much do you lose if you convert yourself into a war zone? You ask yourself, what kind of relations you're going to have with countries that are sources of investment, countries that are sources of your food security, of your energy security, at a time when you're importing 80% of your energy needs, and you fashion your foreign policy accordingly. And in your neighborhood, obviously, you need to keep the country safe and secure. You have to show a robust capacity to defend your territory and your integrity and your sovereignty strongly and firmly. But at the same time, you also have to show the confidence of fixing a strategic objective and hewing to it in the long term. And that strategic objective for us has to be peace, because we really can't afford the distraction of a perpetually hostile enemy on the borders. We don't want the albatross of an ever-looming war around our neck when we are focusing on our economy, on our internal transformation, on the growth of our people and pulling them out of poverty. So if you can keep that perspective right, you'll understand why the last thing any Indian government ought to want is a war with Pakistan, or indeed a war with anybody else. Trade, investment, growth, those are our priorities, and we need to use our foreign policy to promote that. So when it comes to what's happening right now, my answer is I think the government has actually handled it very sensibly. They realized they could not ignore some of the public outrage about an incident like the beheading on the border, but at the same time, they didn't want to escalate problems to a level in which you were down the slippery slope towards conflict. They wanted to pull it back because they know that in India's longer-term interest, we will avoid war. We wish to avoid war. We will never avoid war when the price becomes too high. if we feel that our nation's self-respect or its basic security is imperiled, then of course war always remains an option. But till then, this larger, overarching vision of peace must animate our government, and I think it's doing so right now.
Shashi, your book wonderfully argues that the framing of all foreign policy today has to be around domestic concerns and domestic imperatives. Why is it then that the government, your government, the government of India, does such a poor job of explaining to its people, us, them, that these are the reasons why we are behaving in a particular fashion? Why is there this lack of communication, even about foreign policy, with its domestic, constituency?
Well, it's tough, Tarun, not just in our country, in any country in the modern era. Certainly in any democracy, where you've got multiple channels of communication, and anything you say to your own people is also heard by a foreign audience. Do you, for example, can a foreign minister or a defense minister appear to be signaling to a potential adversary that we are, that we're not
either prepared or not prepared for
exactly. War. So there are things that one can explain. I mean, things I could say as an MP, or I guess that I'm saying to today now because I have no formal responsibility for foreign policy or security policy, that a foreign minister or a defense minister might hesitate to say for fear of it being interpreted or misinterpreted or overinterpreted across the border. So these are some of the challenges when it comes to signaling in foreign policy. Sometimes people use public speeches to talk tough without actually wanting to do much more about it. Sometimes you have to read between the lines of things that are said and left unsaid. A lot of the challenge with foreign policy communication is that what your public hears may be something quite different from what you've been trying to signal to somebody across the border.
There's a whole school of thought that believes, Shashi, that one of the problems is that we went nuclear, and so did Pakistan, declared ourselves as nuclear. And that has somehow, instead of providing a détente on the possibility of war, it's provided a peculiar syndrome by which you can take provocation to a very, very high level, safe in the belief that conventional war will not follow because the threat of nuclear hangs. Something like we've seen happen just now. So you can actually provoke a lot, way beyond the norms of sort of, boundary lines, safe in the thought that conventional war and punishment will not follow. What would you say to that?
Well, that actually, if that is entirely true, it's to our disadvantage. Because the fact is, what happened in 1998, I was not in the Congress Party, I was in the UN in those days. I'm not a big fan of nuclear weaponry one way or the other. But one thing it did do to our disadvantage was that it gave Pakistan the opportunity to equalize with us, which in conventional terms they could not do. In other words, as long as the only declared capacities were conventional, India's was by far the larger army, the larger air force, the larger navy, and by far the most significant preponderant military capacity. By conducting the nuclear explosion and opening the door to Pakistan to do the same thing, we essentially suddenly found ourselves at parity. And indeed, in the years since, it is often said that Pakistan may well have gone faster and farther in developing a nuclear arsenal than we have. So suddenly we are at a disadvantage. We're no longer the bigger power, because in a real, crunch, if it really came to a nation's survival, they have means of destruction that are equivalent to the worst we have, and maybe more. And that, therefore, is not a very good thing. Conversely, however, it does, as you say, if nuclear war is unthinkable, there is always a risk that other kinds of conflict, therefore, are less unthinkable. And within a year after the blasts of '98, the Kargil adventure happened, where Pakistan felt emboldened to send soldiers in mufti across the line, thinking that indeed there would be a limit to how far India could escalate in retaliation. What they overlooked was that India, without escalating, without crossing the line of control, was able to expel the intruders, and we were able to prevent it from becoming that sort of problem. But the next time, after the Parliament attack, when the then NDA government again put the forces on alert, they did not go farther for various reasons, one of which could well have been the perils of risking a nuclear conflagration. So my own feeling is that, by and large, both sides should not be thinking about war, nuclear or otherwise. I talked about why war is not in our interest. But objectively, war is not in Pakistan's interest either. They are assailed by innumerable internal problems. They have an insurrection, the so-called Pakistani Taliban, which has even hit their own military. You've had Rawalpindi GHQ and a naval base in Mehran being attacked by homegrown terrorists in Pakistan. You've got Shia-Sunni disturbances. You've got serious kinds of sectarian problems there. And of course, you've got the ongoing war in Afghanistan and the potential troubles on the western border. So from Pakistan's point of view, why should they want the distraction of one more conflict? Surely peace with India would enable them to focus on overcoming their other problems. And the economic advantages, there have been studies done by bodies like the Karachi Chamber of Commerce, which have actually established that Pakistan would gain enormously from normal trade patterns with India. That Pakistani consumers would benefit. Poor Pakistani consumers right now who are getting Indian goods shipped via Dubai, repackaged as made in the UAE and sold to them at 4 times the price, will get stuff cheaper directly from India. And Pakistani business people will get a huge market in this country for the goods they make that at the moment they can't sell easily here. So there are good arguments on both sides for peace. It's not only ours. But I would argue that, that if we go into the other logic, the logic that leads us down the path you hinted at, indeed, it would be unthinkable and not worth contemplating.
Shashi, just try and disentangle for us, as we're playing it out now, there's this whole very romantic notion of the engagement with civil society. And you know, we all love Pakistanis disproportionately, all of us, you know, the ordinary Pakistani, you know, when we meet them, wherever we meet them. Is there a real value game in the whole civil society attempt? Or is it just something that is a complete sideshow with no inflection at all with the formal relationship that we have with Pakistan?
No, I think the answer is somewhere in between. I actually chaired a debate, which I think was telecast on Headlines Today on the 10th of January, between debaters from India and Pakistan on this very subject, you know, where the civil society, the topic said, was the most important factor in making peace between our countries. And I think the answer lies in between, in the sense that I believe civil society is a factor. It's not irrelevant, but it's certainly not the most important factor, because governments still are the only institutions that can make peace. Civil society has its own limitations. They can hold candles at Wagah, they can conduct discussions in seminar rooms or at literature festivals, but they can't actually move armies, parliaments, or governments. And that's why ultimately they can help create conditions or help promote an atmosphere that's conducive for people to understand each other better and contemplate peace. But what they cannot do is actually deliver peace themselves.
Before I ask you to forecast the next year or two's relationship, the trajectory of a relationship with Pakistan, with a lot of political upheaval going on there and at our end for, in the next year, we'll go back to a man both of us love, to Nehru, whose I would say, whose soul and shadow hangs over 60 years of Indian foreign policy. I mean, I'm not very clear when I read even your book, what was Nehru's position between 1947, or let's say 1950 and 1964, vis-a-vis Pakistan, where the foreign policy relationship was concerned? What was his thinking about it? We know he had great clarity about his positioning Indian foreign policy between the two poles, the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Bloc, and the capitalist bloc, the American bloc. He wanted an equidistance between them. You present that very well in the book, on how he fundamentally understood that we couldn't risk, as a country coming out of 200 years of colonialism, we couldn't risk our own sovereignty, our own volition, in a situation where we became party to any of the two blocs. And we had to pretty much establish our own presence on the global landscape before we began to align with anyone. But it's not very clear what his attitude or what the seeds of his attitude to Pakistan and what a foreign policy should be was. Can you explain that? You know, give us a
Yeah, he didn't take them very seriously, to be honest. I think he had a bit of contempt for the Pakistani state as he saw it, with all its deficiencies, its military coups, its short-lived governments. Early on, the Pakistanis sent an emissary talking about a defense alliance against the communists, and Nehru sent them away with a flea in their ear, saying, I don't need your help to defend against anybody, and certainly we don't see the need for defense against Russia and China, which is what the Pakistanis had wanted. And then, of course, when Pakistan decided to join SEATO and CENTO, the Asian equivalents of NATO, Nehru, who was proud of his own self and the nation's independence and his own ability to make his own decisions and the whole non-aligned approach, he really had contempt for Pakistan's decision to do that. So I have to say that I don't think he paid them much attention, but it should be pointed out that towards the end of his career, he did something extraordinarily generous towards Pakistan, which is to conclude the Indus Waters Treaty. We had actually no legal obligation at that point to share any of the Indus Waters with Pakistan, but he knew that Pakistan was extraordinarily dependent on a reliable and predictable flow from the Indus for its irrigation in Punjab and so on. And he signed what was a very, very generous treaty, the Indus Waters Treaty of 61, in which Pakistan has been guaranteed a certain quantity of water, so that even if India conducts any dam construction and so on upstream, those can only be run-of-the-river projects. In other words, the same water that we might divert into a dam will have to flow back into the channel, so it goes down to Pakistan again. So he's been very generous, very kind to them. And also, literally at the moment of his death, he had sent Sheikh Abdullah to Pakistan to discuss the terms of an enduring peace settlement on Kashmir and everything else that divided the two nations. And Sheikh Abdullah always believed that if Nehru had not died on the 27th of May 1964, that perhaps he might have come back with a peace that could have completely reshaped the subcontinent. So one will never know what might have been, but Nehru did try and make that gesture, that effort, to conduct some
Has it been a costly oversight, his easy dismissal of Pakistan and its troublemaking potential?
At the time, no. And as I said, if you look at it, we had no physical or military conflict between the two countries. There's a lot of rhetorical conflicts, particularly the United Nations speeches on both sides.
And the first war comes a year after he dies. The first
war came a year after he died, but as I said, there was a peace effort underway at the time that he died. But the first war was initiated by Pakistan, by a Pakistani so-called field marshal, promoted himself to that rank, Ayub Khan, who sensed, he thought, weakness in India 2 years after the defeat by China in '62 and the death of Nehru. He thought India was vulnerable and he could make a march, and of course he was proven wrong. But I'm not sure that that was something that could have been predicted by Nehru. I would argue that that in many ways Nehru's focus on the global stage was not just appropriate for the times, but in many ways gave India a stature which was more than we really deserved, than our intrinsic strength, economics, power, or military capacity actually merited. And I think that is something to Nehru's credit. He became a sort of symbol for the newly freed peoples of the developing world in ways that we forget today.
No, so we'll come back to Nehru in a bit, just to again establish his primacy and centrality in shaping our positioning and foreign policy. But would then we be right in saying that the crystallization of our approach to Pakistan, that more muscular approach, it comes with Indira Gandhi?
Yeah, well, 71, of course, was a situation which was thrust upon us. What the West Pakistanis did to East Pakistan was a purely internal affair of Pakistan, but it had consequences for us. The world's largest refugee crisis in human history, 10 million people crossing a border and coming over, was something we had to suffer. And we were a poor developing country who suddenly had to face this enormous burden. Yes, I would say that Indira Gandhi probably also saw this as an opportunity to right a strategic wrong and to divide Pakistan permanently, instead of having potentially two flanks. Though that second flank had never bothered us too much. Even in '65, the war was essentially fought in the West. Yeah. But nonetheless, I think it was seen as a strategic opportunity that she seized, but her principal motive was to undo a situation that India was going to be saddled indefinitely with 10 million refugees. So we first helped organize and support and finance and arm the Bangladeshi resistance, the so-called Mukti Bahini. And then when Yahya Khan was foolish enough to declare war on India, or jihad on India, we moved in and very decisively in 17 days overcame it. But even Indira Gandhi was quite generous in the terms of the Simla Accord. She was quite generous in the release of the prisoners of war. We had 93,000 Pakistani prisoners of war on Indian soil for 6 months after the '71 war. And they were in some ways a major bargaining chip. Many argued at the time that we should hold them until a permanent peace settlement was signed with Pakistan. in which Pakistan relinquished all claims to Kashmir and everything else, and we could move forward. But Bhutto managed to persuade Mrs. Gandhi that this would destroy any prospects of democracy in Pakistan, because his own position would become unviable if he signed such an accord. And so he ended up with a far better accord than a defeated nation had any right to expect, and the prisoners were released without any quid pro quo. So one could argue that Indira Gandhi was tough in 71, but rather generous in 72.
Atal Bihari Vajpayee, another key figure in the last 60 years. How would you rate his interventions and his initiatives?
Mixed. I mean, Vajpayee, as you all remember, took that famous bus journey across and made that historic speech. But then within months, or not very many months anyway, came the Kargil incursion, which sort of seemed to show up his naivete. Then after that, of course, we went into a deep freeze for a while with Pakistan. Then you had the attack on Parliament, and then we went on alert, and war seemed to be threatened. A couple of years later, he seems to be convinced that war is not a viable option, and then we have the peace offensive of 2003, 2004. So it's an up and down kind of thing. Do we see an adroit statesman, as the BJP would portray him? To some degree, yes. He didn't do anything reckless or irresponsible. But do we also see somebody who had to change his mind more often than once? Somebody who perhaps was guilty of a certain level of naivete at one point? But somebody who did in the end keep that larger picture in mind that I talked about at the beginning, why in the larger interest of India, we needed to make peace with Pakistan. And one could argue that it was only by 2003, 2004, in the wake of 9/11 and the Americans going, all guns blazing into Afghanistan, that he finally had a viable peace partner in Musharraf. That before 9/11, Musharraf and the Pakistani military could not be trusted. By 2003, they needed to talk, they needed peace with India, and Vajpayee, could be said, seized that moment.
There's been a whole vast cast of characters helming both Pakistan and India over the last 62 years. If you were to pick one person who's had the maximum inflection on the state of affairs between India and Pakistan, would we say it would be General Zia-ul-Haq?
Probably. Zia did a number of things that have had a long-lasting impact on us. The first is, of course, his Islamicization of the Pakistani military. Up to Zia's coming to power, the Pakistani military was still very much like the Indian military, trained in these colonial traditions, that old Sandhurst, stiff upper lip, scotch in the evening, clean-shaven kind of military. And then it was Zia who brought in the beards and the bearded elements, even the ones who were clean-shaven but had a beard in their heads, you know. I mean, and that I think was a significant change in the nature of the Pakistani military. Second, he took advantage of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to pump a lot of American money into not just the Pakistani military, but into the creation of the ISI and into the irregulars, the Mujahideen as they were called at the time, who went on eventually to become the nucleus of all these militant groups and terrorist groups that the Pakistani military funded. The ISI was created in Zia-ul-Haq's year. It was created, I'm told, with some CIA advice and expertise, which it has since outgrown by all accounts. But that again is a Zia-ul-Haq legacy. And thirdly, it was Zia-ul-Haq who invented the tactic, not at that point over Kashmir, but over Khalistan, the then Sikh-led insurrection in Punjab, the tactic of trying to undermine India not by direct confrontation, but by financing, arming, equipping, and facilitating terrorism from across the border. So those three major changes that occurred under Zia have all had a lasting impact today, and therefore I would agree with you, it's Zia that had the biggest impact.
Given how polarized, Shashi, the opinion largely is in India against Pakistan, I mean, a kind of an accretion of many things, an accretion of propaganda, myth-making, the reality of wars, the religious kind of, hectoring. What sort of political figure would it require in India to break through this kind of, curtain of ice now? What would it require? What sort of, because, we've had this discussion for decades in Delhi, that even when people imagine that there are things that need to be done, there isn't the courage or the assurance of positioning for any political leader in India to embark on it. Even finally Vajpayee, all he could do was take a bus journey and leave it at that. What sort of leadership would it require? Would it be let me just be sort of random and say, would it be a very strong a right-wing leader who could break the old order? Or would it be a very new, young leader like Rahul Gandhi who could break this?
You can see that coming, right?
Yeah, So what would it require to break the old order, of doing things?
Yeah, you know what I'm going to say if you phrase it that way. But actually, though I do think that a new, fresh, young mind will make a big difference, the honest truth is no one Indian leader alone can deliver a lasting peace with Pakistan. You will always need that second hand to clap with. I know for a fact that no Indian leader has been more committed to a durable peace with Pakistan than Prime Minister Manmohan Singh from the very beginning. And yet, even at a time when he had the solid backing of our country and society, what went wrong came from that side. I mean, 26/11, don't forget, was inflicted upon us at a time when we were actually in the middle of a peace process. And my good friend Shah Mahmood Qureshi, who was the Foreign Minister of Pakistan, was actually in Delhi negotiating a more relaxed visa regime the day of 26/11. So we suddenly realized that, even if you're trying to make peace with an elected civilian government that says all the right things, you've got characters in Pakistan are capable of completely blowing it up, as indeed 26/11 proved. So that's the biggest worry. You could have, I still remember the great hopes that were created when Rajiv Gandhi and Benazir Bhutto first met and spoke to each other, and the perception there that these two bright, fresh, young people, foreign educated, untainted by old hatreds, etc., forward-looking, youthful, they would bring about peace. And Benazir was out within a year and a half of meeting Rajiv Gandhi because there was a military coup, including perhaps, for one of the reasons behind that coup may well have been that the military felt that she might go too far towards making a lasting peace with India that wouldn't suit the Pakistani military. So given those equations, I think your question is unfair in placing the onus on the right sort of Indian leader, because I don't think it's the Indian leader alone that's going to make it. I would even say that ultimately it'll be a 60-40 equation. You would need 60% to come from that side, because you'll need 30 from the civilians and 30 from the military before you can have the 40 from our side to make that peace.
The last question on Pakistan before we get off it. Do we then see ourselves in a kind of status quo for very many years to come, given that even the US, with all its kind of might and all its investment over time, political and financial, into Pakistan, has actually not been able to bend Pakistan to be another kind of country? Are we then doomed to be locked into this kind of really, touchy, prickly, bleeding, ugly relationship for a very long time to come?
I hope not. I mean, there's one problem, of course, and that is that that we don't really know what the balance within Pakistan is going to be tomorrow or the day after in terms of military versus civilian rule and so on. But there are some interesting trends in that society in the last few years. There's definitely been an awakening of civil society. We saw it with the lawyers' movement that brought down Musharraf. We're seeing it now with this recent march in Islamabad. We've seen it with the rise of Imran Khan last year and the crowds of young people supporting him. There are some interesting changes taking place in Pakistan that bear watching. Secondly, you are seeing to some degree a declining influence of the military, especially as the amount of American money being pumped into their coffers has declined in the last couple of years, thanks to their own trying to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds that the Americans are finally wised up to. And third, you've also got, it seems to me, something that I can't quite put a finger on, but a sort of exhaustion within the political establishment in Pakistan, across the board, right, left, center, religious inclined, liberal establishment, whatever, with the whole process of indefinite hostility. I've been to Pakistan, talked to people. I sensed a sense of, we really need to get on with our lives. How long are we going to continue maintaining this conflict? Certainly the business community is now anxious to reap the fruits of normal trade with India in the 21st century. There was a gentleman whom I don't know, the famous Maulana Fazlur Rahman, who made a statement last year saying that the urgency of saving Kashmir now must take second place to the urgency of saving Pakistan. Now, when a right-wing political / religious leader says a thing like that, that is a shift in the discourse. You're seeing younger op-ed columnists writing in the papers saying, why should Kashmir want to join us? It's Pakistanis saying, why should Kashmir want to join us? They're so much better off with India than with us. And these are unthinkable thoughts being expressed. So that subtle shift that one is seeing in the Pakistani discourse gives me sort of straws of hope that maybe there will be grounds for possible accommodation. But you know, with Pakistan, we've all smashed our crystal balls a long time ago.
There are two other sort of beasts in our front yard, yeah? China and the US. So let's talk a bit about China. Do you think that to some degree, Nehru in the 50s was not too off the mark in imagining that we should have a great sense of brotherhood with China, which in a way goes back pretty much into 2 millennia or more? What went wrong with China at that point in the 1950s? Historically, explain that to us. What went wrong, resulting in the 62 war? Because I have heard now that we are able to look back at our own history, that maybe it was not China that initiated that conflict, but there were some misgivings on our part, or some errors on our part that actually led to that conflict. What's the story on that 1950s, 60s with China?
That'll be a very long conversation, though. I'm going to try and give you the short version. That actually, this is not a new theory that we were at fault. In fact, the London Times correspondent here, Neville Maxwell, wrote a book called India's China War as far back as 67, where he alleged that we had provoked the war. And there are some who've made that case, but for the most part, I think it's difficult to fault Nehru's perhaps woolly-minded idealism about China. He really saw India and China as these two great Asian civilizations that had long been oppressed by colonialism and foreign presence, that were finding their voice and beginning to reassert themselves in the middle of the 20th century. And he saw ourselves as natural brothers. Whereas I think many in Beijing resented this, felt they were being patronized by Nehru. For example, when Nehru sort of took it upon himself to fly the Chinese delegation to Bandung and introduce Zhou Enlai around, he thought he was doing a wonderful favor to the Chinese, plugging them into the international system from which they were largely excluded. Most countries still recognized the Kuomintang regime in Taiwan as the official China. And Nehru thought he was doing them good, but apparently they took it with bitter resentment that who the heck are these Indians to be patronizing us. And so all of that created, I think, a certain backlash from China. And as Liu Shaoqi said in 62 when they went to war, they said, we felt it was time to teach India a lesson. And that teaching India a lesson was, in my view, the principal motive behind the Chinese action, as well as, of course, a particular strategic imperative they had to actually take that northeastern bit of territory in Jammu and Kashmir called Aksai Chin, because through it they wanted to build a road to connect Tibet to Xinjiang, to their westernmost province. And they actually felt that that was not territory that mattered to India, and if India had been willing to negotiate at that time, it is said China might have agreed. Well, since then, there have been something like 17 border conversations since the thaw in our relations. We're still no closer to settling the border on mutually acceptable terms. And that's even though China has actually settled its land borders with every other neighbor. So that's a bit worrying. On the other hand, Tarun, I'd point to something else. Our trade with China has gone up 250 times in the last 20 years. We now have $74 billion of trade with China in the last fiscal year. And in fact, the two governments are speaking about reaching 100 billion by 2015, and they'll almost certainly exceed that target because they've always managed to exceed every target for Indian trade with China in the last 10, 15 years. So that means that China is developing a growing stake in India, in the Indian economy, at a time when its Western trade markets are actually shrinking with the global recession. So it seems to me that any potential military adventurer in China who might want to fool around on our border would actually have more and more reason to think twice or three times before doing that, because they have now very soon $100 billion riding on good relations with India.
You know, one of our ambassadors to China, I was talking to him over dinner some months ago, and he said to me that we spend all our time thinking about China, but in China they don't think about us at all. And he said, actually, you know, the Chinese are really like Punjabis. All they want to do is they want to know where can they make money. And if there's money to be made in India, they love us. It's as simple as that. Is that a facetious reading, or is that fairly accurate? In both things. One, that they really don't think that hard about us as we obsess about them. Two, that really it's about business and trade for them and little else.
Yeah, on the first one, only a Chinese can answer that, but because every time I meet a Chinese, they seem interested in India, but that's because they're talking to me. So I don't know, maybe they aren't. Maybe they aren't very much. But the second point is absolutely spot on. Certainly in all my 7 or 8 visits to China, I've seen people who are much, much more materialistic than we've ever realized could be possible in a country that used to call itself communist. In fact, a Chinese businessman friend of mine said to me rather memorably, said, we call ourselves a communist country ruled by a communist party, But he said you can search high and low, you won't find a communist in China. To find a real communist, you have to go to Kerala.
The US, okay, we are running out of time, so we'll put China aside for the moment. The US, our great obsession with the US, you know, that old famous thing, you know, even when we hated them, it was Yankee go back home, but take us with you, you know. I mean, so this great personal obsession with America and the possibilities of America. I'm actually going to ask you a slightly more complicated question to understand what you feel about it. You know, you and I are part of a generation that grew up actually with a great deal of animus towards Indira Gandhi, because we felt she was, in a sense, the architect of the emergency, and she had this whole kind of a deceptive sleight of hand of the foreign hand, which allowed her to get away with a lot. We've seen a lot of declassification of the CIA papers in the last 10 years. Many of these declassified papers seem to suggest very clearly that the CIA was very, very routinely involved in destabilizing democracies across the world, especially in Latin America and Asia. Given that, is there a case to actually have a revisionist view of Indira Gandhi and the fact that she was up against a very, very powerful superpower like the US, who was inimical to the independence that we had declared for ourselves, even in foreign policy terms, as architected by Nehru, who insisted on keeping our arm's length distance from everyone. And they would have had great reason to actually mess around in our backyard. And I'm told now, as I talk to people who knew Mrs. Gandhi at that time, that she often lived in fear of being actually assassinated by the cohorts of some foreign agency or the other. And that was a true fact. Is there a case for the fact that she lived in real alarm about the CIA's likely interventions in our backyard? They were in Pakistan, but also in India. And therefore, a lot of her actions at that point were dictated by that, one. Second, were we in a sense actually fortunate that we had somebody like Indira Gandhi, who happened to be Nehru's daughter, a great global statesman's daughter, and therefore had the self-assurance to actually stare down the likes of Nixon and Kissinger and keep us as who we are?
Yeah, it's a complicated question to which there isn't a simple answer. I certainly have revised my own views of Indira Gandhi since those days, and I do have enormous respect for what she did in '71. There's no question that it was a very sure-footed, visionary, confident and tough leadership that gave us the biggest strategic and diplomatic triumph in contemporary Indian history that '71 represented. But on this question of what many have at that time called her paranoia about the CIA and so on, there's really nothing in any of the declassified materials that have come up in the last few years. And you know, the documents of that period have only just begun to be declassified in the last decade. There's nothing that suggests any active campaign to destabilize the Indian government, because even though they didn't like her, and they never hid their dislike of her, and Kissinger and Nixon have been revealed as having said some very unparliamentary things about her in their private conversations, nonetheless, they did not particularly seem to see it in the US interest to bring the Indian government down, or the Indira Gandhi government down, nor was there any major effort to prop up an alternative or anything like that. So it's difficult to allege that there was any such intention. But let me go beyond '71 to 2013, because what we're seeing with the US today is actually an unusually interesting relationship, where the things that are holding the Indian and the US up together are an extraordinarily compatible worldview, that we really don't disagree on anything fundamental. Where we disagree, we've been able to disagree with respect, such as on Iran, for example, where the US, or some elements in the US, might want more out of us than we're prepared to give. They might want an India that perceives itself as an effective counterweight to China, and we feel we have our own logic in our relations with China, and we don't want to play anybody else's game. But at the same time, with enough respect mutually for the way we're moving forward. And the whole thing underpinned by a level of people-to-people contact that is quite astonishing, thanks in no small part to the over 3 million Americans of Indian descent who are influential in the American political space, who are big donors, big fundraisers, big campaigners, and even big candidates. 2 of America's 50 governors are Indian Americans. So with all of that, India is in a different place now in its relationship with the US than it's ever been. And I think we can actually afford to be a little relaxed about the Indo-US relationship for the foreseeable future, because all these factors cannot change overnight. But Tarun, if I may just make a larger point going beyond the US, one thing that's interesting about the way, I mean, in my book, Pax Indica, India and the World of the 21st Century, I actually argue that we've now got to a stage where we can think beyond non-alignment. See, we're living in a world in which really the metaphor is that of the World Wide Web of the internet era. A metaphor in which really countries are linked together in networks, in a variety of network relationships, in different configurations and combinations for different purposes. So that we in India can belong to both the G77, which is the global trade union of developing countries of the UN, and the G20, which is the global management. That we can belong simultaneously to the non-aligned movement, which reflects our colonial history and our, if you like, our anti-Western chip on the shoulder, and also to the community of democracies, where we are alongside the very Western countries whom we've railed against the non-aligned movement. Every year the Indian foreign minister gets together with Russia and China in an annual meeting called RIC. Then we add the Brazilians and the South Africans and we have BRICS. Then we take out the Russians and Chinese and we have IPSA for South-South cooperation. But then we add the Chinese and we don't put the Russians, and you have BASIC for environmental negotiations. And India is the only country that belongs in all of these combinations, and not merely because our name begins with that very useful element in any acronym, a vowel, but because we actually have a useful role to play in all of them, and because these are all legitimate ways of pursuing our interests as a country. This is why I've suggested in the book, somewhat irreverently, that we've perhaps entered an era of multi-alignment. Now, our foreign service doesn't like that term, so it's not going to get much traction. But I'm arguing essentially for a world of multiple relationships. And in the 21st century, I think India should leverage these relationships to play a larger and more profound role on the global stage. In everything from outer space to cyberspace, we have expertise, technological capacity, and the ability to make a difference. We ought to start doing that.
There's lots of more stuff to talk to him about. There's Myanmar, there's Sri Lanka, there's the whole question of has our moral authority in international affairs slipped? These are arguments that go on all the time. But we've run out of time. They've been waving madly. We're going to open it to the audience for a couple of questions very quickly. Does someone have a mic? Yeah, will you? Yeah. Just make it a question and make it short, yeah?
Yeah. I have two questions.
Make it one.
Okay. In an interview in Atlanta, Imran Khan said that he will solve all the issues of Pakistan in 90 days. And even the corruption issues will solve 7 days. Do you think it is possible for him to do this? And he is overconfident that he will make the government in the next election.
Look, I'm now a politician. I know that when politicians campaign, they make an awful lot of promises that they're not entirely sure they can easily fulfill. Solving all the problems of Pakistan in 90 days, let alone all the problems between India and Pakistan in 90 days, is not going to be easy. Let's put it that way. Obviously, we wish him well if he does well. I actually know Imran personally. I consider him a friend. I think he's got tremendous talent. He's a great orator. He's got vision for his country. But whether he's going to win is the first question. And if and when he wins, whether he can tackle so much in such a short time remains to be seen.
Will you just speak into the mic? Will you please speak into the mic?
By the time Parvez Ashfaq retires, by the time Ashfaq Kiani retires and his colleague retires, you'll be having from to the
Okay, we are having. Can you hear him? No.
Yeah, his question was about the time the present leadership of the Pakistani military retires, you'll have a lot of colonels coming up who were recruited in the Zia era. Is that a worry for India? Yeah, I mean, that's already happening, and frankly, given what has already been done by the Pakistani military and the ISI, and after the experience of 26/11 and so on, it's difficult to imagine things can already be much worse than they have been in recent years.
Just one question. Just want to know, how can India overcome the general perception, both global and domestic, of it being completely a soft state, completely inept and clueless, about how to deal with cross-border aggression as against a country like Israel, and how aggressively they've dealt with Hamas-occupied Gaza?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that is a generalized perception around the world or anywhere else, but since you say it, let me point out that the political reality of both India and Israel is extremely different. There is, first of all, the fact that Israel is living in a sea of permanent hostility that it's prepared to accept, and does indeed conduct military actions without much concern about what their neighbors are going to think about them, and indeed as a result their neighbors don't think very highly of Israel in their midst. Second, that the power equilibrium between Israel and, say, Gaza is so disproportionate that it would be the equivalent of us being 100 Indias against a Pakistan. We don't have that kind of equilibrium. We're facing one of the world's largest, most powerful armies and a nuclear power to boot. So the more important issue, as I've said, is that some sort of military response a la Israel might give you short-term gratification. But the fact is that once the bombs have been dropped, you'll have to live with the consequences. The consequences include the end of any viable peace process, the risk of having essentially eliminated the prospect of any constituency for peace within Pakistan, because everyone will have to rally around the flag if they're being bombed by India. Third, you will have created hostility that will drive away investors and other people from your own economy, so you will essentially be plunging your own economy into trouble, affecting your own balance of payments, affecting your own current account deficit, affecting your own people's future. And all for what? Will you have actually solved the problem with the kind of bombing raids Israel has conducted? Will you in fact have suddenly resolved Pakistan's issues with India overnight? It's very difficult to claim that you need some sort of robust military action, because very often the more effective, tough-minded action is the non-military one. I think, for example, the way we conducted ourselves after 26/11, which was to resist all the calls for carpet bombing from certain television anchors and so on, and to instead put heavy diplomatic pressure on Pakistan, work with other countries, like-minded countries, isolate the extremist elements there, have actually given us many years of peace thereafter, which I'm 100% sure a bombing campaign would not have.
Can I also ask, Shashi, that the Nehruvian shadow, that along with the muscular and the pragmatic, you also have to play in the moral, still is part of our guiding policy?
It is there, but it's not the be-all and end-all. I mean, if it were, 71 wouldn't have happened. We are proud of the Gandhian heritage. We are proud of the way in which we've conducted ourselves as a country in world affairs. But we are not, I'm afraid, a pacifist. We wouldn't have developed nuclear weapons. We wouldn't have the world's, one of the world's largest armies. We wouldn't have the kind of military capacity we have if we were completely unwilling to use it when we need to.
Tarun sir, sir, I would like to ask a question to Tarun sir. मैं आपसे जानना चाह रहा था तरुण सर तरुण
Somebody has a mic there. Will you just let him ask the question?
हेलो सर ये वसुधैव कुटुंबकम की जो भारतीय संस्कृति है ये हमारी फॉरेन पॉलिसी में कितना महत्वपूर्ण रोल अदा करती है I would like to know.
The world is a family.
Yeah, well, the world is a family. That's why we are very major and active members of the United Nations. That's why we have been trying to do a great deal, for example, through our contribution of Indian troops for international peacekeeping operations. Why is it in the interests of India to have its own soldiers risk their lives in places like Congo or the Golan Heights? It is so merely because we do feel a commitment to global peace and justice around the world, and that's why we are active players in that. So yes, it is relevant to our foreign policy.
You know, we've run out of time.
Burma?
The questions on Pakistan and China will go on. I just want to say that one of the things that Shashi lost his job the first time around for was his tweeting, and it wasn't taken pleasantly, his sense of humor and his playfulness with Twitter and with tweeting. I think the great triumph for Shashi is going to be that I anticipate one of these days the Congress party will be actually knocking at his door to ask them to teach them all tweeting, now that they've decided social media matters a lot. So Shashi is probably going to be tweeting you all off right away on Twitter. Thanks for being here. Thank you very much, Shashi, for the very eloquent and articulate explanation for everything. Thank you.